each year, as we reflect on his life and the example that he set for us and his dream of a beloved community in which love and trust prevail over fear and hatred, while we have come closer to achieving that dream than we were in his lifetime, we still have a long way to go. Dr. King lived through war, segregation, racial inequity, unrest, and violence. That violence ultimately took his life at the age of 39. He knew he would not see the beloved community in his lifetime, but he had an unshakable faith that we would achieve it. In his last public address on April 3rd, 1968, he said, "I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." We find ourselves in 2021, as he did in 1968, in a time of racial inequity, unrest, and even violence. And his words and guidance are as relevant today as they were then. Now, more than half a century after his death, we find ourselves in a world that seems no less divided. And we can't help but ask how and when we will find the beloved community. We still ask the question he pondered in the final year of his life. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? You've heard me echo that question on this floor and in communities across the Commonwealth since 2018, when the King Commission, in commemorating the 50th anniversary of his death, explored that question in the communities that Dr. King himself visited in Virginia. In Dr. King's time, he talked about the fierce urgency of now. The urgency of creating the beloved community has become even more starkly apparent today. For some, it's already too late. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, David Marcus Peters, among others, did not live to see the beloved community, nor did any of the victims of violence and brutality whose lives we mourn. The hundreds of thousands of people who've died of COVID-19, disproportionately black and brown Americans, did not live to see the beloved community. For the countless others, mostly black and brown Americans who died due to other health disparities before the pandemic. And just last week, on January 6th, we witnessed a dark day in the nation's history, one that grew from seeds of mistrust and division sown over many years and stoked by increasingly hateful, violent, and paranoid rhetoric over the past 4. Last week, insurrectionists sought to take by force what they could not win at the ballot, some specifically calling for civil war and looking to harm the Vice President of the United States and members of Congress. The events of January 6th stand in direct opposition to Dr. King's vision of a beloved community. It is in this world that we reach for the beloved community again. In this world, irreversibly changed from a world a year ago. The beloved community feels more distant than ever, but is also this changed world that has uncovered and exposed the work ahead of us. The wounds that remain from 402 years of history persist, and the prevalence of white supremacy persists. The injustice and inequity that was woven into the fabric of our society did not magically disappear when laws and policy that set it in place were changed. All of this has been laid bare. Frankly, Mr. President, there were times, especially this summer, when I really wonder if it's possible to achieve the beloved community, or whether chaos would consume us as a people and as a country. There were times this summer when I felt the very depths of despair anger, and hopelessness threaten to consume everything as we grapple with the convergence of four crises: a health pandemic, an economic crisis, a reckoning with racial injustice, and a crisis of faith in our very democracy. Yet, Mr. President, through it all, I still find hope. I find hope in the glimpses of the beloved community that we see now, as medical workers and essential personnel make sacrifices day after day to tend to the sick, as teachers and other educators reinvent their roles to keep students safe and engaged outside of the classroom. We find hope as we remove monuments that glorified a past that accepted and allowed slavery and white supremacy. We've begun to tell the complete story of our past, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I find hope as communities and institutions open their eyes to the racism that continues to exist within them and unequivocally denounce it. Dr. King saw that the roots of injustice run deep and affect us all, but he saw that in the same way, the capacity that we have to love others will lift us up. As we have seen events unfold over the past 4 years, and especially since this summer, I've grown increasingly awed by Dr. King's capacity for love and forgiveness, and to maintain hope in the face of hatred, despair, and violence. He never gave up. If anyone should have, it should have been him, but he didn't. As he said, love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. He understood that love is ultimately the only answer to humankind's problems. But he was not just focused on love as an emotion, but love as an action. A love that compelled him and should compel us to confront injustice everywhere. He wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963, "I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." It was that love and concern that took him to Memphis when he died, to take up the cause of trash collectors. It was that love that brought him to Virginia, to at least 13 different localities, from Danville to Petersburg and many more in between. We see the injustice that he saw more plainly than ever. We see that we cannot sit idly by. If we are going to build the beloved community, we each have to do our part, and we have to work together. Dr. King's message is one of selfless and unflinching love, and it is a love that we must carry with us to build the beloved community, whether we get there ourselves or whether we, like Dr. King, have to light a path for others to find their way. But we must do it together. We must start now. We must feel the fierce urgency of now. And so, Mr. President, I move that when the Senate adjourns today, it do so in the memory and honor of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.